more popular than Jesus now? I don't know which will go first, rock and roll or Christianity. That famous quote by John Lennon sums up the Beatles at the climax of their world takeover. The Beatles were an English rock band comprised of 4 members: George Harrison, Paul McCartney, Ringo Starr, and John Lennon. They formed in Liverpool in 1960 and eventually disbanded 10 years later in 1970. The Beatles date back to our parents' generation, so it is almost certain that we have all heard at least one of their songs. Without the Beatles, the world would not be the same today. They influenced many aspects of pop culture, including music, film, and fashion. I have been a fan of the Beatles since I was a kid. I've watched many documentaries and read countless books on the band. First, I will discuss the Beatles' influence on music. Second, the other aspects of popular culture that they helped influence, such as fashion and film. And lastly, what bands were influenced by their music. So now let's begin by talking about the influence on music. Is it working?
Not working.
I don't think so.
I don't know. Sorry, try it with that.
Can I do it on here?
Yes.
Okay. The Beatles broke barriers in music by accomplishing feats never before done by an artist. Their use of lyrics, vocals, and instruments helped create a sound that remains unmistakable to this day. According to listverse.com, they were the highlighted subject of the first ever live global satellite TV broadcast in June 1967. They were also the first live entertainment group to perform a concert stadium, performing in New York's Shea Stadium in 1965. The Beatles' musical versatility also played a role in their changing of the music scene forever. Michael Tomasky of the Daily Beast talked about their musical versatility on January 28th, 2014, stating, "First, they popularized the rock and roll 2-electric guitar sound. Second, they broke down the wall between teen music and adult music." The Beatles began their career with happy-go-lucky songs that brought innocence and joy to their listeners. Throughout their career, they matured their sound, reaching a pinnacle moment with the release of Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band in 1967. Rolling Stone named the album #1 on the 500 greatest albums of all time. The magazine raves, "Sgt. Pepper is the most important rock and roll album ever made, an unsurpassed adventure in concept, sound, songwriting, cover art, and studio technology by the greatest rock and roll group of all time." The Beatles went on to eventually have 31 albums on the Billboard 100, and they hold the record for the most #1 singles of all time. Now that we have discussed some of their musical accomplishments, we will now discuss some of the aspects that they helped influence in pop culture that still inspire today's generation. The Beatles not only progressed musically, but they also developed their style. They began the 60s with their signature mop tops and simple suits that helped kick off the mod era in London and eventually moved to the United States. As the 70s came, they moved on to bold suits and hippie-like hair and mustaches. They managed to land yet another spot on a list of Time magazine's top 100 fashion icons of all time. Meg Gibson, who wrote the article, states, "Not only were the Beatles selling records, they were selling trends. Though the Beatles were perhaps the best rock and roll band in history, it was their style savvy that gave them a boost toward being a bona fide worldwide cultural phenomenon." Not just fashion, but also a handful of films released, the impact that they managed to make on cinema is profound. Jenny Wood, author of Info Please, stated in an article, "Magical Mystery Tour was important for being an early inspiration for music videos, while Yellow Submarine, an animated film released in 1968, helped establish animation as a serious art form. A Hard Day's Night was their first film release and managed to gross $1 million, which at the time was unheard of. It also got nominated for 2 Academy Awards, which is considered the most prestigious film award in the world." Josh Weinstein, a writer for The Simpsons, also agrees with Wood, stating, "Without Yellow Submarine, there would never have been The Simpsons, no South Park, no Toy Story, no Shrek." Bless you. Now that we have discussed some of the Beatles' influence on films and fashion, we will now talk about some of the artists that they help inspire. After Beatlemania, thousands of artists wanted to assemble in order to help or somewhat get close to the success of the Fab Four. In the early 90s, a grunge group from Seattle exploded onto the scene, with their bold lyrics and in-your-face vocals led by Kurt Cobain. The band was Nirvana, and almost 20 years since they did their debut, they have become one of the most important rock bands of all time. Drummer Dave Grohl told Access Hollywood, "When I was young, that's how I learned to play music. I had a guitar and a Beatles songbook. I would listen to the records and play along. Of course, it didn't sound like the Beatles, but it got me to understand song structure and melody, harmony, and arrangement." After Nirvana's disbandment in 1994, Grohl went on to form his own band, the Foo Fighters. The Beatles made the term boy band popular, or cool for today's standards. Since their disbandment, thousands of boy bands have assembled, including NSYNC, the Backstreet Boys, and most recently One Direction, they're walking in the shoes of the Beatles, having released their own film and being stalked by millions of fans. Were it not for Beatlemania, fans would never have been tested. The limits that they have in order to get close to their idols is very low. Let's take a look at some of the issues we discussed today. First, we talked about the Beatles' influence on music. Then we expanded to film and fashion. And lastly, what musicians they helped inspire. Without the Beatles, the world would not be the same today. They changed and they became the first to do many things. In the words of John Lennon, "You have to be a bastard to make it, and that's a fact. And the Beatles are the biggest bastards on earth."